Marcus Johnson, a 34-year-old black man, was known for keeping to himself. Some said it was shyness. Others believed it was years of unfair judgment that made him cautious. When he boarded the plane that morning, he never imagined a single act of kindness would alter his path forever. He tried to ignore the curious glances that sometimes followed him in luxurious spaces. First-class cabins weren't exactly filled with people who looked like him, yet he had earned his seat the same as anyone else. A short, polite smile flickered across his face as he settled into the plush leather seat. He wasn't there for the fancy meal or the champagne. He simply needed to travel for work, an opportunity he'd worked countless hours to secure. Marcus set his leather backpack beneath the seat, pulled out a well-worn novel he'd been reading for weeks, and flipped to where he'd left off. As he sank into the comfortable cushion, something in him relaxed. The flight attendant approached, offering water or juice. Marcus asked for a glass of orange juice, feeling parched. He nearly dozed off right there, lulled by the hum of the plane's engines, but paused to note the people drifting in around him. His mind wandered to the days that had led him here. He thought of his mother's unwavering support, how she believed in him when no one else did. As a teenager, Marcus had been labeled trouble. Too many run-ins with teachers who assumed the worst. But his mother wouldn't let him slip into that narrative. She insisted he work harder, push further, and climb beyond anyone's expectations. Now, as a data analyst at a growing tech company, he was traveling for an important contract that might open even bigger doors. But old doubts still crept in sometimes. In the corners of his mind, he heard the echoes of people who never believed in him. Marcus nearly drifted off until he heard soft murmuring and frantic whispers. Peering around, he saw a woman standing in the aisle. She appeared unsteady on her feet, one hand clasping the overhead bin as though trying to stay balanced. Her other hand rested on her rounded belly, clearly pregnant. She was scanning the first-class seats as though searching for something or someone. By her side stood a man, nervous and equally concerned. The flight was full, and nobody in the plush seats seemed willing to budge. The woman looked exhausted, and the man's eyebrows knitted with worry. Eventually, they both sighed and glanced down the aisle toward their assigned seats in the back. Marcus watched as the woman's shoulders sagged. Whether it was physical fatigue or emotional exhaustion, he felt a pang of empathy. He imagined the cramped seats, the long flight ahead, and how stressful that would be for an expectant mother. His gaze traveled to the empty seat beside him. He had paid extra for first class, but the simple truth remained. She needed it more. Without another thought, Marcus rose and tapped the woman's shoulder. She turned, surprised to see him standing there, offering a gentle smile. "Ma'am, please take my seat," he said quietly. "You'll be more comfortable here." Her eyes widened in astonishment. The man beside her blinked in confusion. For a moment, it seemed neither knew how to react. Then a wave of relief washed over her face. She tried to protest, saying she couldn't possibly, but Marcus's mind was made up. He gave a small nod, picked up his backpack and gestured for her to sit. The flight attendant, who had been witnessing the scene, gave him an approving nod as she helped the woman settle into the seat. The man, who introduced himself as the woman's husband, mouthed a heartfelt "thank you." Marcus turned toward the coach section, weaving through the narrow walkway with his bag slung over his shoulder. He could feel more stares and hear whispers of curiosity. Eventually, he found the only available seat near the back, squeezed between two large individuals who seemed less than thrilled about the arrangement. But Marcus didn't complain. He tried to fold himself into the seat. At least he had the window. That was something. He inhaled deeply, reminding himself that it was only a few hours. The engine roar grew louder as the plane raced along the runway, lifting skyward. Marcus found himself pinned to the seat as they ascended. He cast a brief glance at the bright morning sky before closing his eyes, feeling the press of the people next to him. Marcus didn't expect anything more from the pregnant woman or her husband. A simple thank you was enough. But life has a strange way of intertwining paths. By the time the flight landed, his casual act of generosity would spin into consequences far beyond a single seat swap. Exhausted from the flight, Marcus disembarked later than everyone else. He trudged into the airport, waiting in line for a coffee to wake him up. He had a meeting to attend in just a few hours. As he rummaged for his wallet, he looked up to find the pregnant woman's husband standing in front of him. "Hey," the man said, offering a nervous grin. "I just wanted to thank you again. My wife's name is Emily, and I'm David. You really helped her out. She had some complications last month, and sitting in coach would have been tough on her." Marcus nodded, trying to brush it off. "It's all right. I'm just glad she could be comfortable." David asked his name, and Marcus introduced himself. They shook hands, and David insisted on buying his coffee. Marcus felt awkward accepting, but David wouldn't take no for an answer. After they placed their orders, David explained they were in town because Emily's father had recently passed away, and she wanted to gather with her family before giving birth. Marcus offered his condolences, uncertain if he should pry further. But David's sincerity was disarming. He seemed to have a grateful, earnest quality, eager to pay back kindness. Before parting ways, David insisted they exchange numbers. Marcus wasn't sure if anything would come of it, but the man seemed insistent. They parted on a warm note, and Marcus hurried off to his meeting. He saw no sign of Emily and felt a quiet hope that she was resting or had found a calmer environment after the stress of travel. Marcus arrived at the downtown office of a prestigious firm that was considering awarding his company a large contract. He had studied all the data and was determined to deliver a pitch that would make them trust his firm's analytical expertise. In the conference room, he took a seat at a long glass table, facing two stern-faced executives. A middle-aged woman with graying hair pulled into a tight bun, and a younger man tapping a pen on the table. Their expressions gave nothing away. Marcus had to push aside any lingering nerves. He'd prepared for weeks, practically memorizing data sets and anticipating questions. As he explained the scope of what his company could offer, he detected subtle flickers of intrigue in their eyes. But halfway through his presentation, the older woman gave him a hard look. "What makes you think your team can handle this project? We've spoken to a lot of firms. Many have more experience in the field than you do." Her voice was sharp, echoing with the unspoken question, "Why should we trust you?" Marcus steadied himself. "We may be a younger firm," he replied, "but we've got a diverse, talented team that's already delivered results for organizations like yours. We integrate fresh approaches with reliable data analytics. We're nimble, adaptable, and resourceful. You'll get a personalized focus you can't find at larger corporations that rely on old methods." He offered a carefully placed smile, though he could tell she was still unconvinced. The younger man chimed in, acknowledging the data Marcus had provided. There was a flicker of hope in Marcus's chest. He launched into a detailed explanation of projection models, and moments later, he witnessed their guarded gazes soften, replaced by a sense of cautious approval. When he finished, both executives stood, shook his hand, and promised to be in touch. Marcus left the building uncertain, but at least feeling he hadn't stumbled. As he walked out onto the busy city street, Marcus turned his phone back on. 2 missed calls from an unknown number. Then a text from David. "We'd love to treat you to dinner." The invitation felt odd, but something about the situation tugged at him. He had no family in town, and truth be told, loneliness often crept in on these work trips. He rarely traveled for pleasure, so an offer of company and gratitude could be a welcome break. Marcus found a moment to text back, saying he was free that evening. Shortly after, David sent an address and time. That evening, Marcus made his way to a modest bistro tucked away from the main avenues. A gentle light glowed from within. David stood outside, waving. Emily was beside him, her face lit with a warm smile. She walked carefully, but there was a calmness about her. They welcomed Marcus like an old friend, ushering him inside. Soft jazz notes played in the background. They chose a round table near the corner, a comfortable spot for conversation. The server arrived, handing out menus and pouring water. Emily expressed her gratitude firsthand. "I don't think I truly thanked you," she said, her eyes glimmering with genuine appreciation. "That plane ride was longer than I expected, and with everything going on, I was at the end of my rope." Marcus shrugged gently. "I'm happy to help, really." David chimed in, describing how anxious he'd been. "You saw how nobody else even moved. It's one of those moments where you realize how rare kindness can be." David exchanged a glance with Emily. "We know it might sound strange, but there's something we wanted to talk to you about." Marcus raised an eyebrow, uncertain. "Sure." Emily took a breath. "We're having this baby soon. My due date is only weeks away. We came here to handle my father's estate. It's complicated, and we could really use some help." She paused, fiddling with the edge of her napkin. "We don't expect you to solve our problems, but we have a sense that you're someone we can trust." Marcus was taken aback. "Me? You hardly know me." Emily nodded. "We know that's part of why this is awkward, but you offered up your seat, no questions asked. Most people wouldn't do that. It just made us think that we'd like to work with someone who cares more about doing the right thing than their own comfort." David cleared his throat. Emily's dad had a business. We don't know the full scale of it yet. There's some complex financial stuff. We were hoping to find someone with data expertise who could sift through the numbers. We have an attorney, but we need a clearer picture of what we're dealing with. We can pay you, probably not at the level your firm pays you, but it's a side project. Are you interested? Marcus's mind spun. He'd come to the city for an official pitch, and now here was a personal request for help. He asked a few cautious questions. What kind of business was it? How much data are we talking about? Emily explained that her father ran an import-export company. After his death, she discovered there were multiple accounts, perhaps some off-the-books transactions, and many confusing spreadsheets that seemed incomplete. "I don't suspect anything illegal," she said, her voice wavering slightly. "But my dad had a habit of trusting the wrong people. I want to know if someone might be taking advantage of us." Marcus considered the possibility. It would require time, but it could be done in off hours. He was also struck by how powerless Emily seemed, dealing with her father's death and preparing to become a mother. "Sure," he said, surprising himself. "I can look at it. Send me what you have and I'll see what I can do." Emily's relief was palpable. She visibly relaxed, leaning back in her chair. David wore a broad grin. They ordered dinner, and for a moment, the mood lifted. They spoke about everyday things, the name they had in mind for the baby, how Marcus got into data analytics, Emily's childhood memories of her father. Gradually, the conversation circled back to one subtle topic that neither David nor Emily had voiced explicitly: the uneasy tension they sometimes felt around certain people's reactions to them. Emily was white, David was also white, and Marcus was black. The dynamic of the dinner with them in a small bistro drew occasional glances, but within the comfortable bubble of their conversation, those glances seemed distant. After dinner, they walked out together. The night air was cool, and the city lights sparkled around them. Marcus felt a sense of connection he hadn't expected. As they parted ways, David clapped Marcus on the shoulder. "Thank you again, man. You've already done so much for us. We'll be in touch soon." Marcus nodded, feeling a mix of emotions. He had come to the city for work, but now he was stepping into something far more personal. As he walked back to his hotel, he couldn't shake the feeling that this chance encounter on a plane had set something significant in motion. Marcus stepped out of the car, his eyes scanning the weathered apartment complex. The building looked like it had seen better days, with cracked paint and a few broken windows. Tom followed close behind, his expression tense. They exchanged a quick glance before heading toward the entrance, their footsteps echoing in the quiet morning air. The apartment number they were looking for was on the 3rd floor. As they climbed the stairs, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that they were stepping into something far bigger than they had anticipated. The hallway was dimly lit, and the faint smell of mildew lingered in the air. When they reached Ronald Fletcher's door, Marcus hesitated for a moment before knocking. A few seconds passed before the door creaked open, revealing a man in his late 50s with graying hair and a wary expression. "Yeah?" he asked, his voice rough. "Mr. Fletcher?" Marcus began, trying to sound calm. "My name is Marcus, and this is Tom. We're here about Grace Carver. Her father was your business partner, right?" Ronald's eyes narrowed, and he glanced over his shoulder before stepping out into the hallway, closing the door behind him. "What about her?" he asked, his tone guarded. Marcus exchanged a quick look with Tom before continuing. "We're trying to figure out what happened with her father's finances. There's some suspicious activity, and we think someone might be blackmailing Grace. We were hoping you could help us understand what's going on." Ronald crossed his arms, his jaw tightening. "Look, I haven't been involved with Carver's business in years. We didn't exactly part on good terms. If there's trouble, it's got nothing to do with me." Tom stepped forward, his voice firm. "We're not accusing you of anything. But Grace is pregnant, and she's under a lot of stress. If you know anything at all, that could help us figure this out, we'd really appreciate it." For a moment, Ronald looked conflicted. He glanced down the hallway, as if checking to see if anyone was listening, then sighed. "All right, fine, but not here. There's a diner down the street. Meet me there in 10 minutes. Marcus nodded, and they headed back down the stairs. As they walked to the diner, Tom muttered, "Do you think he's hiding something?" "Maybe," Marcus replied, "but he's our best lead right now. Let's see what he has to say." The diner was a small, cozy place with a retro vibe. They grabbed a booth near the back and ordered coffee. A few minutes later, Ronald walked in, sliding into the seat across from them. He looked around nervously before speaking. "All right," he said, keeping his voice low. "I'll tell you what I know, but you didn't hear it from me. Grace's dad, he was a good man, but he got mixed up with some bad people. There was this guy, Clyde Harris. He ran a shipping operation, and Carver started doing business with him. At first it seemed legit, but then things got complicated." Marcus leaned forward, his interest piqued. "Complicated how?" Ronald hesitated, then continued. "Clyde was into some shady stuff. I'm talking money laundering, maybe even smuggling. Carver found out, but by then he was in too deep. He tried to cut ties, but Clyde wasn't having it. They had a falling out, and that's when I left. I didn't want any part of it." Tom's eyes widened. "So you think Clyde's the one blackmailing Grace?" Ronald shrugged. "Could be. Or it could be someone else who's tied up in this mess. Either way, it's dangerous. If I were you, I'd be careful. These guys don't play around." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. This was worse than he had imagined. "Do you have any proof? Anything that could help us take this to the police?" Ronald shook his head. "I wish I did. But like I said, I've been out of the loop for years. All I know is that Clyde's operation is still running, and he's not someone you want to cross." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of Ronald's words sinking in. Finally, Marcus spoke. "Thanks for telling us this. We'll be careful." Ronald nodded, then stood up. "Good luck. And tell Grace, tell her I'm sorry about her dad. He didn't deserve what happened to him." After Ronald left, Marcus and Tom stayed at the diner, processing what they had just learned. "This is bigger than we thought," Tom said, his voice tinged with worry. "If Clyde's involved in something illegal, we could be putting ourselves in danger." Marcus nodded, his mind racing. "We need to be smart about this. Let's gather as much evidence as we can and then go to the police. But we have to keep Grace out of it as much as possible. She doesn't need this stress right now." Tom agreed, and they left the diner, heading back to the car. As they drove, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He glanced in the rearview mirror, but the street behind them was empty. Still, the sense of unease lingered. When they got back to Tom's house, Grace was waiting anxiously. "What did you find out?" she asked as soon as they walked in. Marcus hesitated, not wanting to alarm her, but he knew she deserved the truth. "We talked to Ronald Fletcher. He said your dad got mixed up with a guy named Clyde Harris, who's involved in some illegal activities. We think Clyde might be behind the blackmail." Grace's face paled, and she sank into a chair. "Oh my God, what do we do now?" Marcus knelt beside her, his voice calm but firm. "We're gonna figure this out, Grace, but we need to be careful. We'll gather evidence and then go to the police. In the meantime, you need to focus on staying healthy. Let us handle this." Grace nodded, though her hands were trembling. "Thank you, Marcus. I don't know what we'd do without you." Marcus gave her a reassuring smile, but inside, he felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. This was no longer just about helping a friend. It was about uncovering a dangerous criminal operation, and he knew that the stakes were higher than ever. Over the next few days, Grace recovered. Marcus visited, bringing her favorite tea and offering moral support. They tried not to talk about the blackmail or the investigation in front of the baby, but once they were certain Grace and the infant were safe at home, Tom confided that the detective had given them a heads-up. Clyde Harris was being investigated, and search warrants were issued for his warehouse. They hoped it would yield enough evidence to press charges. Marcus felt a measure of cautious optimism. Then came a phone call that shattered their fragile peace. It was Ronald, his voice shaking. "I got a call from someone claiming to represent Clyde. They said if I keep talking, they'll come after me. Marcus, I don't know what to do. I'm terrified." Marcus took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "Stay calm, Ronald. Let me contact the detective right away. Don't answer any unknown calls. If you feel unsafe, call the police." He dialed the detective, who advised Ronald to file a formal complaint. Marcus relayed the message, but the sense of dread returned full force. This was more than idle threats. If Clyde or his associates felt cornered, they might resort to drastic measures. That night, Marcus paced his hotel room, considering whether he should leave the city or remain until the situation was resolved. He decided to stay. He'd come this far, and leaving now felt like a betrayal of Grace and Tom's trust. Another week passed with no new threats, though the tension remained. The detective assured them that progress was being made. Meanwhile, Grace focused on caring for her newborn, Tom hovered protectively, and Marcus checked in daily. Finally, the breakthrough arrived. The police raided Clyde Harris's warehouse. They found evidence of smuggled items, falsified shipping records, and a trove of documents implicating Clyde in multiple scams. The next day, Clyde and 2 associates were arrested. The blackmail letters matched documents on their computers, linking them to attempts to strong-arm Grace. As the news broke, Marcus felt a mix of relief and exhaustion. The shadow that had loomed over them for months was finally lifting. Grace hugged him tightly, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered. "You saved us." Marcus smiled, though his heart was heavy with the weight of everything they'd been through. "We did it together," he said. "Now you can focus on your family." As the days turned into weeks, life began to return to normal. Grace and Tom settled into their new roles as parents, and Marcus found himself reflecting on the journey. It had been a harrowing experience, but it had also shown him the strength of human connection and the importance of standing up for what was right. Though the scars of the past would remain, they had emerged stronger, ready to face whatever the future held. Marcus smiled as he held the wedding invitation in his hands. The elegant script on the card brought back a flood of memories. Memories of Grace, Tom, their baby, and the unexpected journey that had intertwined their lives. He hadn't seen them in person for a few years, but their occasional texts and photos kept him connected to their world. Grace's sister, whom he'd never met, was getting married, and the invitation felt like a warm embrace from a family he hadn't realized he'd become a part of. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the invitation. The wedding was in 2 months, and it would require some rearranging of his schedule. But as he thought about it, he realized he couldn't miss it. Not just for Grace and Tom, but for himself. It felt like a chance to close a chapter he hadn't fully acknowledged was still open. The weeks flew by, and before he knew it, Marcus was boarding a flight to the wedding. This time, he wasn't scanning the crowd for someone in need of his first-class seat. Instead, he settled in comfortably, a small smile playing on his lips as he thought about how far he'd come. The plane ride was smooth, and as the wheels touched down, he felt a mix of excitement and nostalgia. The wedding venue was stunning, a picturesque garden with blooming flowers and twinkling lights strung between trees. Grace spotted him first. Her face lit up as she rushed over, pulling him into a tight hug. "You made it," she exclaimed, her voice filled with genuine joy. Tom followed close behind, shaking Marcus's hand with a firm grip and a warm smile. The baby he'd once held as a newborn was now a lively toddler, running around with a flower crown slightly askew on her head. "She's grown so much," Marcus said, watching the little girl giggle as she chased a butterfly. "She has," Grace replied, her eyes soft with pride. "And she's got your stubbornness, you know. Once she sets her mind on something, there's no stopping her." Marcus laughed, feeling a strange sense of pride himself. He spent the evening catching up with them, hearing about how they'd finally settled the estate, how Tom had started a new business, and how Grace was pursuing her passion for painting. The shadow of Clyde Harris and the blackmail scheme felt like a distant memory, replaced by the warmth of their new beginnings. As the night went on, Marcus found himself introduced to Grace's extended family. Her sister, the bride, thanked him profusely for coming, calling him the man who saved my sister's life. Marcus brushed it off modestly, but the gratitude in her eyes was undeniable. He danced, laughed, and even shared a toast with Tom, who raised his glass and said, "To Marcus, our family's guardian angel." The words stuck with him long after the wedding ended. On the flight back home, Marcus reflected on the evening. He thought about how a single act of kindness, giving up his seat on a plane, had led him to this moment. He thought about the friendships he'd forged, the challenges he'd faced, and the person he'd become through it all. Back in his hometown, Marcus returned to his routine, but something felt different. He found himself more attuned to the people around him, more willing to step out of his comfort zone. He volunteered at a local shelter, mentored young professionals at work, and even started writing a memoir about his experiences. It wasn't about being a hero, it was about being present, about recognizing that every small act of kindness could ripple out in ways he'd never imagined. Years later, as Marcus sat on his porch watching the sunset, he received a text from Grace. It was a photo of her daughter, now a confident young girl, holding a trophy from a school science fair. The caption read, "She says she wants to be a detective when she grows up, just like you." Marcus chuckled, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. Life had a funny way of weaving stories together, and he was grateful to be a part of this one. He typed back, "Tell her to aim higher. She's already got the heart of a hero." As he set his phone down, Marcus leaned back in his chair, a quiet smile on his face. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. He realized then that life wasn't about the grand gestures or the dramatic moments. It was about the small, everyday choices that defined who we were. And for Marcus, those choices had led him to a life richer and more meaningful than he'd ever imagined. As the weeks turned into months, Marcus found himself reflecting on the events that had unfolded at the wedding. The warmth of Grace's gratitude, the sincerity in Tom's handshake, and the quiet understanding they had shared that night stayed with him. He realized that moments like those weren't just passing interactions, but anchors, small yet significant markers in the grand narrative of his life. Marcus continued his work with an even deeper sense of purpose. His career was thriving, yet he felt a growing need to contribute more meaningfully beyond the walls of his office. Volunteering at community centers had become a quiet yet fulfilling part of his life, a space where he could extend the same kindness that had once altered the course of Grace's story. One crisp autumn afternoon, Marcus found himself on another flight, this time for a business conference in Chicago. As he settled into his seat, he glanced around, his habit of quiet observation now second nature. A few rows ahead, a young father was struggling to comfort a fussy toddler while simultaneously juggling a diaper bag and a small carry-on. The exhaustion in his eyes was evident. Without hesitation, Marcus stood, walked over, and offered a hand. "Here, let me hold that for you," he said, gesturing to the overstuffed bag. The man hesitated for a second before offering a relieved smile. "Oh man, that would be a lifesaver. Thanks." As Marcus helped stow the bag, the little girl in the father's arms giggled, reaching out to tug at Marcus's sleeve. He chuckled, giving her a small wave before returning to his seat. It was a small moment, barely noticeable to most, but to that father it meant the world. And to Marcus, it was a reminder. Kindness, no matter how small, had a way of rippling outward. His phone buzzed in his pocket later that evening, just as he was settling into his hotel room. A picture of Grace's daughter, now a little older, popped up on his screen. She was grinning widely, missing a front tooth, holding up a drawing of a family. Grace's message followed. "She drew this today. Said it's about all the people who helped us. Thought you should see it." Marcus felt a lump rise in his throat. It was moments like these that reminded him why he had made those choices, why he had given up his seat that day, why he had stayed when things got complicated, and why he continued to choose kindness whenever he could. He typed back a simple response. "Tell her I love it. And tell her she's got an amazing artist's heart." As the days passed, Marcus found himself growing closer to the people around him in ways he hadn't expected. He reconnected with old friends, deepened relationships with colleagues, and even started mentoring a few younger professionals in his field. He realized that life wasn't just about success. It was about connection, about the way one small act could weave its way into the lives of others, altering their paths in ways they might never fully understand. One evening, months later, he received an invitation in the mail. It was from Grace and Tom, a formal invite to their daughter's 5th birthday party. Alongside the invitation was a handwritten note from Grace. "Your family to us, Marcus. We hope you'll come." As he held the letter in his hands, he smiled, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the soft glow of his living room lamp. He had made a difference. And in return, that difference had made him who he was. He didn't hesitate to RSVP. Because some stories he had learned never really end. They just keep growing, unfolding, and carrying us forward in ways we never expect. And Marcus was more than ready to see where this one would go next.